I'm taking off my watch, Mary, to be good. Good evening, everybody. It's always a great privilege to be here. And there's no better place to talk about the idea of a republic than here, because under Joe's benign dictatorship, we have a republic for a week. You know, this is what a republic is like, actually, isn't it? I mean, it's people communing together and talking about their future together in an atmosphere of equality. Okay, 20 minutes. So I'm going to do 2 3s and a 5. Let's start with the first 3, the 3 pillars of our democracy. The 3 pillars of pretty much any democracy that comes out of the Enlightenment of the 18th century: separation of powers. You have the executive, you have the legislature, and you have the legal system, the judiciary. And I want to suggest that, first of all, that each of these 3 has failed catastrophically. And that this failure perhaps requires us to think radically about the consequences of partition. One of our great incorruptible leaders once said that Northern Ireland was a failed political entity. I think what we've got to accept is that partition, which was both inevitable in my view and tragic. You know, there's often a debate about whether partition was either an inevitability or a tragedy. Well, maybe it was both. Maybe there was no other way to resolve the fundamental difficulties and conflicts on the island at that time. But that doesn't mean that its consequences were not tragic. And maybe what we have to face is that what partition produced was 2 failed states. One that failed, very obviously and very grotesquely in obscene violence, but one that failed in slower and less violent and less obvious ways, but actually in ways that ultimately have proved to be institutionally just as catastrophic. A system of justice here, which allows us to properly prosecute people who commit the most socially destructive crimes. Individual crimes are prosecuted quite well in this state. Social crimes, crimes which actually do generational damage. I mean, generational damage. Over 50 years, maybe, of damage in relation to what we're dealing with at the moment, are largely unprosecuted. And this has not changed. Insider trading, for example, which is a crime in every capitalist democracy. Even within terms of the rules of capitalism, you can't do insider trading. You can do it in Ireland, because the High Court Inspector decided that insider trading is only bad if you know that you're using inside information. Jim Flavin, whom the Supreme Court said Jim Flavin used insider information, and that this was a fraud on the market. The Supreme Court said that. The High Court Inspector is appointed to look into it, says, yeah, but he didn't know he was using inside information. He just happened to buy the shares with the inside information, but he didn't really connect the 2 things. Time and again, no bishop has been prosecuted for facilitating child rape, for example. Nobody has been prosecuted for the systemic corruption of the planning system. Systemic. I mean, the Mahon Tribunal found this was endemic and systemic. The corruption trial collapsed last week in Dublin. That's it. There is nobody else is going to be prosecuted for this. So there's a complete failure, I would suggest, of the judicial system, the whole justice system. And I'm not saying that these individuals are corrupt. I think most people are trying to do a decent job. I'm not at all suggesting that they're collusive in this. But there is a systemic failure of the prosecution service, of the guards, and of the courts in relation to producing results for the public. And thirdly, most extraordinarily, the one thing we've always said is that the other 2 arms of governments are problematic, but the executive is strong. The central government, the government dominates everything. And even that is now untrue. It has been true historically over the course of the existence of the state. And now we have a situation, look at the lead story in the Irish Times today, a minister in the cabinet, Joan Burton, is saying, actually there's a real problem, because cabinet decisions are now being essentially made by the so-called Economic Management Committee, which is 4 middle-aged men, by the way, not a woman in sight, and their unelected advisors, who are accountable to none of us. And of course, beyond that, the basic idea of the cabinet, which is that it is the sovereign entity which makes decisions in Ireland, has of course been torn up. And there's been an incredible timidity about even saying this, that the constitutionality of a lot of what's happened in Ireland over the last 5 years, it seems to me, is extremely dubious, because cabinet decisions are not being made. For example, and, if you say this stuff, it sounds like some kind of hysterical conspiracy theory. It's just fact. It's a fact, for example, that the budget 2 years ago, we know this, was delivered to the Finance Committee of the Bundestag before it was given to the Cabinet. I mean, this is a matter of fact. It seems to me that is a complete breach of the Constitution, which says the only body in Ireland which can make government decisions is the government, and the government is the Cabinet. We had cabinet ministers saying, when it came out that the Finance Committee of the Bundestag had the budget, saying, well, we don't mind about this. Sure, it hasn't been decided yet because we haven't seen it. But in fact, we then know subsequently that it was word for word. The budget that was delivered by Michael Noonan was the budget which had been scrutinised by the Finance Committee of the Bundestag before. So, I would suggest that it is not at all an exaggeration, or not at all hysterical, or not at all a conspiracy theory to say that each of the three fundamental pillars of democracy is at the very least severely cracked. If you were a building inspector, you would condemn this building. It really is unsafe. So that's the first three. The second three I'd just like to advert to is we declared a republic here 3 times, which itself might suggest that there might be a problem. It was declared by the Fenians in 1867. The same organisation, the Fenians themselves, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, as they were properly known, declared it again in 1916, apparently forgetting that they had already declared it in 1867. And of course, it was declared again in 1948, 1949, declared in Canada, an apparent whim by Taoiseach, with a kind of farcical replay of the 1916 declaration being played out at the GPO with very few people there, and made no difference whatsoever. So the point about the Declaration of the Republic in 1948 is nobody noticed. I mean, it was a bit like Dorothy Parker said about, was it Calvin Coolidge, heard that he had died, and said, how could they tell? How could we tell that Ireland had been declared a republic? And of course, the name of the state wasn't even changed. People call it the Republic of Ireland. It's not called the Republic of Ireland anywhere. The soccer team is about the only place that I can find where it's actually called the Republic of Ireland. So if republic, so meaningless they declared it thrice. Have we ever gone through a process of actually seriously thinking about what a republic is and whether we want to be one? Or is it just a kind of rhetorical construct that we could declare again tomorrow without actually noticing what that might mean? So it seems to me, both in terms of the first trio of the actual operation of the state and conceptually in relation to the history of the Republic, that we're actually in a pretty, serious situation. We're almost facing a kind of a blank slate where neither the state nor the notion of a republic actually has very much content. And so, with these discussions this evening, we can look at this 2 ways. We can lacerate ourselves and say, isn't it terrible? Or we can actually say, maybe there's something good about this. Maybe instead of mourning for something we've never had, that's only ever been a rhetorical construct, and talking about how we've lost the republic, we might start thinking about founding one, and founding one with some kind of meaning that starts from the fact that there's been an enormous systemic failure of the entire system of governance, and also a large conceptual failure in terms of what the intellectual contents of a republic might be. So we can talk a little bit more about what that might be, but let's, I'm going to keep the time, so let's just look at the 5 things that we might begin with in terms of talking about how we might actually create a republic here. I think it's important to say that the whole importance of this is that if you recognize that the whole construct has actually collapsed, it gives you a certain kind of freedom and a certain kind of hope, right? Which is, talking about getting rid of the Senate, for example, is the most ludicrous piece of, magicians, Tommy Cooper, they do this thing called misdirection, where what a magician does is with one hand they're doing this, and at the other hand they're doing a magic trick. But it's Tommy Cooper misdirection. So the Taoiseach, not even the Taoiseach at the time, Kenny decides, gets a kind of inspiration from God, stands up in front of a crowd of people and says, "I'm going to abolish the Seanad." And that becomes reform. That's what reform of a catastrophically failed system means. Again, the question of the abolition of the Seanad is, how could they tell? I mean, go back to Dorothy Parker. It makes no bloody difference one way or the other. My own view is that we're better off with it than without it, but it's such a meaningless question. If you ask in polls, roughly 5% of people say they would like to keep the Seanad as it is, right? And the 95% are not being given the choice, which is, do you abolish the Seanad or do you completely transform it into something else, which is a really functioning part of our democracy? So instead we're being faced with, a choice of abolition or a choice of 5% of people, and I don't know who those 5% of people are, but I've never met anybody, including senators, who thinks that the current Seanad is a defensible organisation. They're probably people who confuse it with something else. So the whole exercise, this whole referendum, is a parody of direct democracy. It's simply a way of carrying out some kind of exercise of reform that is not just meaningless, but I would say actually insulting of democracy, because it's not giving people any real choice. So the point about reform is that it has to be coherent, it has to be multifaceted, and it has to involve every part of the system. If all the parts of your system are in trouble, then tinkering around with bits of one of them is a completely meaningless, and I would suggest insulting exercise. So how would we begin to look at a kind of coherent approach to change? I don't think this is at all that mysterious, I mean, I think most people know precisely where the problems lie. The first problem is the obvious gap in Irish democracy, which is in local democracy. What are the strengths of Ireland? What are the strengths of our society? The strengths of our society are very largely concentrated in the local. We're very, very bad at the national. We're very good at the local. You look at every community in Ireland right now, you look at events like this, you look at the literacy programs that have been going on over the summer. I visited a few of them, and they're fantastic things going on. You look at the sports camps, you look at what the GAA is doing, you look at people raising money for a kid to have a heart operation, you name it, you can go through, So the first thing to get rid of is this idea that there's apathy in Ireland. There isn't apathy. What there is people are concentrating on what they think they can affect, which is at the local level, and they're giving up on the national and the international. So the key to change is, start with what you're good at. We're good at the local. Why don't we unleash those local energies? And unleashing the local energies means having genuine, participative and deliberative democracy at a local level. Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. A lot of small societies, the Danish ambassadors here, Denmark does very good local democracy. There's lots of models of the way local democracy works all over the world. We don't have to copy any one of them. We can take the best of them. We can start afresh. We can think this thing through again. And we can begin to do democracy rather than just talk about it. Secondly, if you do that, one of the key reasons for doing that is not just about the local, it's because of what happens right now is that when you don't have the local democracy, what happens is you localize national democracy. So there's a need there, which is for engagement with the local, which is passionately felt by people. And because it's not being done at the local level, what happens is it gets pushed up the system. And what you create is a kind of grotesque localization of the national. So you don't have national politics. What you've got essentially is all the stuff that should be happening in local democracy is being done at the national parliamentary level. If you were to have genuine local democracy, then absolutely you don't need a massive apparatus of 166 or whatever it's going to be, 153 TDs. 100 TDs is plenty. Maybe in that situation, one chamber of parliament. If we had one chamber of parliament that actually did national politics, we'd be a hell of a lot better off than we are with two that do local politics. And we would actually be getting somewhere, perhaps, with the creation of a parliament whose only function is to enforce accountability and to initiate legislation. That a parliament that's actually not there to do all of the local stuff which should be being done at the local level. Thirdly, if you were to do those two things, then this key idea of accountability becomes possible. And what you would start with is answering one of the most basic questions, which is, why is nobody ever accountable for anything? This is, I would suggest, has sort of two aspects of it. One is, and it's been referred to earlier on today in some of the sessions, it's a very boring subject, but the Ministers and Secretaries Act, is one of the most farcical distortions of administrative logic in Ireland, right? Minister Secretaries Act says basically the minister is responsible for everything, which sounds great. It sounds like it's a very democratic, accountable system. Except what happens in reality is that every time there's a screw-up, the minister actually quite reasonably says, well, how would you expect me to know what was being done by a principal officer in the department in Cork? I didn't know. And you could then, everybody, the opposition say, resign, 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 and the minister says, nah, and the public says, well, sure, he probably didn't know anyway, so, nothing ever happens. And there's a relatively simple change you can make here, which is you can make the people who make the decisions accountable for those decisions. So everybody knows that 90% of decisions are made by senior civil servants. And so what you do is you make those senior civil servants personally responsible for the decisions they take. And then if the minister overrides those decisions, or if the minister says, actually, I want to do something completely different, then the minister is responsible for that. You actually establish clear lines of accountability, which we still don't have. I'm still haunted by the phrase, I remember hearing Mary Harney speak this in relation to a very serious issue, which was the deaths of children in the care of the state. And I remember Mary Harney speaking the line on Morning Ireland one of those mornings saying, if we could find out who was responsible for this, somebody probably should pay for it. This was the Minister for Health saying, first of all, that she had no idea who was responsible, but clearly, of course, it couldn't be possibly her. And that lack of accountability in the system can actually be changed by bringing in new kinds of management structures and new kinds of personal accountability, particularly for senior civil servants. The fourth thing you can do, and I think we need to do this immediately, is to follow up on the suggestion of Matthew Elderfield, the financial regulator, who called for the establishment of an inquiry into our legal system. It's pretty impressive and important when your financial regulator feels it's necessary to do this. But we've a lot of talk about a banking inquiry, which will be carried out under legislation where it's unable to make any adverse findings against anybody. How farcical can it possibly be? What we desperately need is an inquiry into the failure of the judicial system to produce accountability, personal accountability for appalling crimes. And I would suggest what we need is the establishment of, three major international figures who are, above reproach, who are given, if we need a constitutional amendment, then do this. Give them complete access to everything in terms of the Director of Public Prosecution's Office, in terms of the Gardaí, and in terms of the courts, to answer two questions. Why is there impunity for white-collar crime in Ireland? And how are we going to end the reign of impunity? That's all we want them to answer. Tell us the answers to those two questions. And the fifth thing, finally, is the biggest change that can happen here is about citizenship. And again, I know a lot of people have spoken very eloquently about this, much more eloquently than I can about it, but we really have to come back to the fact that we have to stop tolerating these failures. We have to stop colluding and enabling this system. Because we do. The electoral survey, the big electoral survey after the last election, asked people, what would you like your TDs to do? Did they say, I would like them to actually govern? I'd like them to make governments accountable. I'd like them to create a situation where we don't land the next generation with another mountain of debt. No, they said, I'd like them to concentrate more on local issues. This is us, folks. This is our democracy. This is the attitude that most of us bring to bear on it. And it's late at night, so I can use the expression, but we have to stop electing godchites. If somebody like Michael Lowry, for example, who has lied to the Dáil, who has evaded taxation and who has been involved in the undermining of the biggest commercial contract the state ever gave, is elected with a larger vote every time more dirt comes out, then there's a sickness at the heart of our democracy in the idea of citizenship. And if large numbers of people will turn out to support Sean Quinn when his family are off, shifting what are now public assets which belong to you and me, being shifted mysteriously around companies from the Virgin Islands to Russia and paying themselves enormous salaries from mysterious companies in Russia, if large numbers of Irish citizens will come out to support the local chieftain rather than the general public interest, then we also have a real problem in relation to our democracy. So we need to change this. And finally, the last thing I want to say is that we can change this. I think there's a mood of general despair at the moment. Let's remember that the two greatest periods of change in Ireland, in terms of both the political system and of democratic and civic engagement, are periods of despair. The 1890s, when the greatest leader Ireland had, probably apart from Daniel O'Connell up to that point, Charles Stewart Parnell, had fallen. There was bitter division between the Parnellites and the anti-Parnellites. The Irish Party was tearing itself apart. The great project of Home Rule seemed to be completely destroyed. Huge numbers of people were completely frowned off with mainstream politics. What happens? Well, modern Ireland comes out of it. Both the state itself ultimately comes out of it in terms of all those movements, in terms of Irish nationalism, but also our society comes out of that period. The GAA comes out of it. The Gaelic League comes out of it. The agricultural co-ops come out of it. The trade unions come out of it. Most of our political parties come out of it. The feminist movements comes out of it. One of the greatest changes that's ever happened in the society. The women finding a political voice happens in that period. We're still living with that. Most of the organisations that still work in Ireland actually were founded sometime around between 1890 and 1910, in that period of political despair. And the second period of despair was the 1950s. When I was talking to people here, earlier on, and older people remembering how abysmal it was to live somewhere like here in the 1950s, but also in most of Ireland. The lack of hope, the lack of resources, the sense that the only thing you could do was emigrate. The sense that the whole political system really had no connection at all with the despair of ordinary people. Out of that period came a revolution of thinking, led by a civil servant, led by T.K. Whitaker, but also led by a politician, Sean O'Mass. And if you look at those two periods, they actually provide us maybe with some kind of map. In the 1890s, it came from the bottom up. It came from people who rejected the state and created their own organisations and their own civic engagement. In the late 1950s, it came from the top down. It came from actual intellectuals and technocrats like Whitaker, realising we've got to rethink radically the whole way that we approach Irish democracy. The challenge now is that we need both of those to happen. We need it to happen from the top down, and we need it to happen from the bottom up. My bet would be that we're much more likely to see it happening from the bottom up, and that it will be the top down will respond when the rest of us gain the courage to begin to engage with our democracy and to demand that a republic be built which is fit for us to live in. Thanks very much.